Okay, think about this for a second. There's this debate, right, been going on for maybe a century,
Mm-hmm.
about whether a company's main job, its main gig, is just making money for shareholders,
Right, the classic view.
or if it actually owes something more, to a much wider group of people.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is how that debate seems to be shifting, like right now.
Yeah, and it's not just theory, is it? How we answer that question, it really matters. It changes how companies act, their place in our towns and
Their
cities.
environmental impact, even.
Exactly, tangible stuff.
Which is exactly what we're digging into today. We're looking at how corporate governance is evolving, moving from that old school shareholder first idea
Shareholder primacy.
towards this growing focus on stakeholder capitalism. It's quite a shift.
It really is. And our map for this exploration is the brand new fifth edition of Principles of Contemporary Corporate Governance, just out, 2024.
Super current then.
Totally. By Jean-Jacques Duplessis, Anil Hargavan, and Beth Nosworthy. Plus, insights from scholars worldwide, it gives a really solid, up-to-date picture.
Perfect. So if you're listening and you like to get a real handle on important stuff pretty quickly.
Without getting swamped in jargon.
Exactly. Whether it's for work, maybe a big meeting, or you're just curious about how the business world is changing, you're definitely in the right place. We'll break down these big shifts.
So the plan is, first, we'll cover that traditional view, shareholder primacy, where it came from.
Okay?
Then we'll look at how the stakeholder idea popped up. We'll also touch on the UK's interesting approach, enlightened shareholder value.
Right. Heard of that.
And then the really big recent stuff, especially out of the US, that's pushing this stakeholder model much harder. And of course, some of the challenges and debates still swirling around.
Sounds good. Okay, let's dive in. That bedrock idea,
Mm.
shareholder primacy. What does it actually boil down to?
Well, at its core, it's the belief that a corporation exists primarily to make profits for its owners, the shareholders.
Simple enough on the surface?
It seems so, but it's got legal teeth. There's a classic U.S. case, Dodge v. Ford Motor, way back in 1919.
Ah, the Ford case, yeah.
That one really hammered home the idea that directors' main duty is to the shareholders' bottom line. The court literally said a business corporation is run, quote, primarily for the profit of the stockholders.
Wow, pretty blunt. So the law itself baked that in early on.
It certainly did in the U.S. context, and its influence has been huge. And then, as big corporations grew in the 20th century, this idea got even stronger.
How so?
Well, think about Berlin Means back in 1932. They wrote about how ownership, the shareholders, became separated from control, the managers running the show day to day.
Right. The shareholders might be thousands of people who never meet the CEO.
Exactly. So a lot of the legal structure that developed was basically designed to make sure those managers didn't forget who they were working for, the shareholders, keep them focused on the financial return.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense in a way, doesn't it? Shareholders put up the money, they take the risk.
That's always been the main argument, yes. And it's crucial to remember, this view isn't ancient history. It's still deeply embedded in company law in many places. Australia, for instance.
Even though the wording might be slightly different.
Yeah, the duty might be phrased as acting in the best interests of the corporation, but for a long time, that's largely been seen through the lens of shareholder value. And older laws, like the English Joint Stock Companies Act from 1844, also helped cement this focus on the owners.
Okay, so that's the established tradition. Deep roots. But then you mentioned stakeholders. Who are they exactly? And when did people start seriously talking about them?
So stakeholders is a much broader term. It basically includes anyone and everyone affected by what a company does.
Not just the owners.
Not at all. Think employees, customers, suppliers, the local communities where the company operates. Even the environment counts as a stakeholder.
Right. Anyone with a stake in the company's actions, basically.
Precisely. And while shareholder primacy really dominated the 20th century, there were people thinking more broadly earlier on. George Goiter, for example, wrote a book in 1961 called The Responsible Company.
Okay, so the idea isn't brand new.
No, but it's really gained momentum in the 21st century. There's just much more focus now on, what's the purpose of a corporation, what's its role, its impact on society. People are starting to see shareholders as just one part of a bigger picture.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned the UK tried something called enlightened shareholder value. That sounds interesting, like a halfway house.
That's a pretty good way to put it, yeah. It was the UK's attempt to kind of nudge things along to acknowledge these other stakeholders without throwing shareholder primacy out completely.
How do they do that?
Through legislation, specifically Section 172 of the Companies Act 2006. It says, okay, directors, your main job is still to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members, the shareholders. But
There's always a but.
there is. But you also have to consider a whole list of other factors. It's like, be enlightened about how you achieve that shareholder success.
And what sort of factors are on that list?
Things like the long-term consequences of decisions, the interests of employees, relationships with suppliers and customers, the impact on the community and environment.
So basically all the stakeholders we just mentioned.
Pretty much. And also things like maintaining a good reputation and acting fairly between different members.
Okay, so think about everyone else.
Mm.
Because it will help the shareholders in the long run. Is that the idea?
That's essentially it. The theory is that by being enlightened and inclusive, by considering these wider interests, you'll ultimately create more sustainable long-term value for the shareholders. The primary legal duty, though, still to the shareholders.
Right, so the benefit to stakeholders is kind of a means to an end, the end being shareholder profit.
That's the criticism, yeah. It keeps shareholder supremacy intact. And there's a question mark over how effective it's really been. The British Academy, for instance, noted that not many companies really adopted purposes beyond shareholder interests under this model.
So maybe not the revolution some hoped for. Okay, let's hop across the pond then. The U.S., the book talks about big shifts there starting around 2018 towards stakeholder capitalism. What kicked that off?
Yeah, things really started moving in the U.S. around then. You had some very powerful voices starting to push for a rethink. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is a key example.
BlackRock, huge asset manager, right?
Yeah.
Manages trillions.
Exactly. So when he speaks, people listen. Starting in 2018, his annual letters to CEOs became really influential. He started hammering this theme that companies need a social purpose.
The social purpose, beyond just making money.
Yes. He argued companies must benefit all stakeholders, not just shareholders, but employees, customers, the communities they operate in. He explicitly linked purpose to long-term profitability.
What kind of things was he pushing companies to think about?
He asked some pretty direct questions, like, what role are you playing in the community? How are you managing your environmental impact? What about workforce diversity? Are you adapting to tech changes, retraining employees, planning for their retirement?
Wow. Connecting those dots directly to long-term value.
Absolutely. And then in 2019, you had another massive development, the Business Roundtable, this group of top CEOs from major U.S. corporations. They put out this landmark statement.
What did it say?
It basically redefined the purpose of a corporation. They moved away from shareholder primacy and said companies should serve all stakeholders, deliver value to customers, invest in employees, deal fairly with suppliers, support communities, protect the environment, while generating long-term value for shareholders.
That sounds like a really big deal coming from the CEOs themselves.
It was huge, a major public shift in stated priorities for corporate America.
So not just investors like Fink, but the company leaders too.
Exactly. And Fink kept reinforcing it. His 2020 letter, A Fundamental Reshaping of Finance, basically doubled down. He argued that this transparent, stakeholder-focused approach wasn't just ethical, it was essential for long-term profitability and sustainability. It drives value.
Okay, so major momentum building in the U.S. How did the rest of the world react? What about somewhere like Australia?
Well, Australia definitely noticed. The Australian Institute of Company Directors, the AICD, called it a major policy change, but they were also quite cautious.
Cautious how?
They were quick to point out that directors' legal duties aren't identical in the U.S. and Australia. You can't just copy-paste the approach.
Right, different legal systems, different obligations.
Exactly. So the AICD stressed that in Australia, the key duty is still acting in the best interests of the corporation, and they're still actively looking at how that duty plays out in practice, especially in light of these global shifts.
And didn't Australia look at something like the UK's Section 172 before?
Yes, interestingly. Back in 2006, there were reports that actually recommended against putting something like Section 172 into Australian law.
Why is that?
The thinking at the time, largely, was that the existing idea of enlightened shareholder value, even without a specific law like the UK's, was probably enough. that directors could already consider stakeholder interests if it benefited the company.
But now, given the UK experience you mentioned and maybe other factors, that thinking might be changing in Australia.
It seems that way. The fact that the UK's approach hasn't been a silver bullet is one thing, but also Australia had its own wake-up call with the Hayne Royal Commission.
Ah, yes, the big inquiry into the banks and financial services.
Exactly, running from 2017 to 2019. Its findings really shone a light on how a relentless drive for profit had often led to terrible outcomes for customers and other non-shareholder stakeholders. It showed the potential downside of a narrow focus.
So, real-world consequences pushing the debate forward.
Absolutely. And the book notes there's even been some recent judicial commentary in Australia hinting that maybe it is time for a clearer legal recognition of considering non-shareholder interests. So things are definitely being reevaluated.
It really feels like a global shift then, even if the pace and mechanisms vary. But you mentioned challenges. It's not all smooth sailing away from shareholder primacy, especially in the U.S.
No, definitely not. Despite Fink and the Business Roundtable, that traditional shareholder capitalism model is incredibly entrenched in the U.S. legal system, in business culture, in how executives are often incentivized.
Old habits die hard.
Very hard. There's still a really fundamental debate going on about what a corporation is actually for.
Mhm.
Changing laws, changing mindsets, changing deeply ingrained practices that takes time and faces pushback.
So the direction might be shifting, but the destination isn't guaranteed and the path isn't clear yet.
Precisely. It's very much an ongoing evolution with lots of different viewpoints and unresolved questions about how to genuinely balance all these different interests.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together for everyone listening. We started with that long-standing idea. Shareholder primacy. Companies exist mainly for shareholder profit. Legal backing, historical context.
Right, the traditional bedrock.
Then we saw the rise of the stakeholder concept, employees, customers, communities, the environment, this wider circle affected by a company's actions.
A growing awareness of broader impact.
We looked at the UK's attempt at a middle way, enlightened shareholder value, encouraging consideration of stakeholders, but ultimately still for shareholder benefit, maybe with limited practical impact.
A step, but
Yeah.
perhaps not a leap.
And then the recent, quite dramatic developments in the U.S., Larry Fink, the Business Roundtable, pushing much more strongly for genuine stakeholder capitalism, redefining corporate purpose.
A potentially significant turning point.
And we saw how other places, like Australia, are watching this, grappling with their own legal frameworks, maybe nudged along by things like the Hayne Royal Commission findings.
Yeah, observing, reacting, reevaluating.
But it's not a done deal. Shareholder primacy is still deeply embedded, and the debate continues.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting now is the argument that this isn't just about ethics or doing good. The case being made forcefully by people like Fink is that considering all stakeholders is actually crucial for a company's long-term health, its sustainability, its profitability in today's world.
Which brings us neatly to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given how interconnected everything is now, business, society, the environment, is that old shareholder-first model really fit for purpose anymore? Is it sustainable in the 21st century?
Or is embracing a wider stakeholder approach not just, the right thing to do, but actually essential for businesses to thrive long-term and for society as a whole to function better?
Something to think about regarding the companies you work for, buy from, or maybe invest in. What could this shift mean for them down the line?
And if you do want to explore this more, that book, Principles of Contemporary Corporate Governance, 5th edition, is a great resource. Or check out Larry Fink's letters online or the Business Roundtable statements. Lots to dig into.